Wonderful. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. And thank you for joining us for the next session on fostering safety across the lifespan, increasing capacity to support older women experiencing gender-based violence in Ontario. It is my great privilege and honor to introduce you to our distinguished speaker today, Amber Wardell. Amber is the Learning and Development Coordinator for the Ontario Association of Interval and Transition Houses. Amber has worked for over 15 years as a community educator, coordinator, social justice advocate, and counselor for survivors of gender-based violence in rural communities. Amber utilizes the intersectional feminist framework with an emphasis on an overall lifespan of developmental perspective. As the coordinator of OAITH Aging Without Violence project, she assisted in developing new tools and resources focused on ending violence against women in Ontario. Amber, thank you for joining us today. It is all yours.
Thank you so much, Mary, and thank you to everyone for joining. And for Elder Abuse Prevention Ontario, for organizing today and creating this new learning opportunity. OAITH would like to start off and just acknowledge the many territories of Turtle Island, Canada, in which we work and reside. We value the relationships we're building as we learn more about the treaties. As a sector, we must continuously work on and lean into discussions and actionable change as it relates to reconciliation and the 231 individual calls for justice. To do this, we require principled leadership that is predicated on the acknowledgement and truths of the harms historically and currently put onto Indigenous communities. These harms, primarily situated in colonial violence, have been upheld for hundreds of years that still exist today in our own organizations, communities, and systems. Understanding these truths will move us from remembering Indigenous women and girls as missing and murdered to knowing them and embracing their strength, knowledge, leadership, solutions, and contributions to create safer communities for all Indigenous peoples. So just a little bit of a roadmap today. I'll talk a little bit about OAITH. Some of you might be familiar with OAITH in our work. Some of you might have been at the last Elder Abuse Prevention Ontario Conference, where I presented on material that kind of laid the framework for some of the very specific tools and resources that I'll be focused on sharing today. And I'll let you know about some training opportunities that you could continue today's learning if you're interested, specifically in gender-based violence against older women, and just talking about that piece of, ongoing skill development and, the continuous learning there. So this is the Aging Without Violence project section of OAITH's website. On OAITH, as I refer to it, is the Ontario Association of Interval and Transition Houses. And we don't provide direct service. Our members provide direct service. So the majority of our work involves public awareness, advocacy, government relations, and training designed to support shelters, second stage programs that meet the survivors of gender-based violence in their communities. So many of the resources I'll share today were developed as part of a project that we did from 2018 to 2021 called the Aging Without Violence Project. And that project was funded by the Ministry of Children, Community and Social Services, and it had a very broad scope. We focused on, in general, promoting awareness of abuse against older women, trans, older adults, gender diverse, and overall really service capacity through training, resource development. We also did research under the project. So this is a section of the OAITH webpage. If you go to oaith.ca, and then if you look on the top right, there's a button called Older Women in pink there. So if you click on that button, you are brought to this section of the website. And we've divided our resources that were developed, some of which I'll go through today, under the Aging Without Violence project into 3 sections. Folks looking for safety and support directly, those who are providing professional support. My sense is, the majority of you, those are the resources you'd be looking for. And also we know that friends, family members, community members who might not be professional supports, they're a really important linkage with direct resources, with direct supports. So we have a section as well that's just for anyone visiting our site that falls into that category. Older women are subject to scams, financial abuse from their own children, and we're at the whim of systems which won't be responsive unless you make noise. We aren't valued, we become invisible. I notice it, how absolutely invisible you can be when you get older, especially if you're an older female, especially given the way in which we construct femininity and the way in which we laud youth. And we don't have much positive to say about older women. So that is a quote that is from a research participant. And when I say older, kind of within our research, we looked at 55 and older. We were guided by a provincial advisory, which included Elder Abuse Prevention Ontario. And that's, what we decided on for that language, although we know that there's a lot of diversity within age groups above 55 as well. This is a interesting quote. It really speaks to something that's at the heart of the project, which is disrupting the invisibility of older women within services. And if we look at gender-based violence services, traditionally they have been built around the needs of younger women and women with children, younger children, youth, and that is apparent in the barriers that we see that are increased accessing services kind of across sectors, but especially if we talk about gender-based violence services. So that might be residential, but it also might be community-based counseling, transitional support, different types of programming that's offered through gender-based violence agencies. Just continuing on, thinking about all of this within that context of a feminist intersectional analysis. I spoke more about this at the last conference from Elder Abuse Ontario, but just kind of a really high level summary there of the resources that you'll see today that I'm going to talk about in detail, which typically you don't really get that level of detail. So hopefully that'll be helpful in seeing what might be good for you in your work, that they are in that context of, a life course perspective, for example, and that's contextualizing the experiences of abuse and violence, potential risk of harm, lethality, with experiences of gender and aging and systemic oppression. And using that intersectional lens helps us to understand that context of experiences of abuse and violence within experiences of gender and aging, systemic oppression such as ableism, ageism, racism, sexism. And all of the resources that we've developed are primarily for older women, older trans, gender diverse individuals. You also might find them helpful if you're doing work with older men. Recognizing, when we talk about trauma-informed work, I'm not going to go too much into that today. There was more of a focus on that in my last presentation. Building off of that, when we think about clients or those that we're supporting within a trauma-informed way, we also have to think about ourselves and our agencies and the work that we're doing in our sector in a trauma-informed way, the different sectors. So recognizing that we're all kind of in different places in relation to, their trauma-informed capacity, their capacity with older adults, perhaps with a gender lens, and really recognizing that as we kind of build collaboration and foster knowledge together. So let's get into some specific tools and resources. Let us know in the chat if you've used these resources, if you find them helpful. We're always, open to feedback at OAITH. One resource that we've had out for a few years, but not everyone is aware of, is Her Brain Chose For Her. It's a pretty unique tool, very much focused on the visualization of trauma. And it's available both as a PDF document, but then also as an interactive web-based application. So you can access it on a mobile device as well, but you're not downloading it from, an app store or the Play Store. You're going right online to access it onto a browser. So her brain chose .oaith.ca. And this here that you're looking at is the list of the learning outcomes for this particular document. It is pretty, pretty lofty, all of these goals and learning outcomes, but it really does have a wide scope. So it wasn't developed for a particular type of worker. It was developed for those who are providing direct service to survivors, with specifically thinking about across the lifespan. So older women, older survivors as well. And it's a great resource for someone who might, enjoy different types of learning because it has that visualization aspect. And the interactivity is very helpful. Sometimes trauma training, sometimes any kind of training can be dry, especially when it has data, it has science, it's got, some kind of contextual pieces in there. And, having something where it's got the creative aspect, it's engaging different parts of the brain. You're able to learn by listening to a voiceover at the same time as actually interacting with some of the material. So it goes over, understanding synaptic activity, neurotransmitters, nervous system responses, and brain structures, and really going beyond fight and flight. We hear that so much, but there are 5 F's. So you can learn more about those other 3 in her brain chose for her, and it's separated by a number of sections. We'll go into a lot of those sections today, just briefly to give you a bit of an overview. Really understanding how traumatic events impact an individual emotions and behavior. How does that then relate to them engaging in care? Or service? What's the kind of implication there if someone has experiences of abuse and the impacts of those experiences, and at the same time is also experiencing dementia, for example. So it talks about kind of how to provide support, how to talk about trauma to someone, how to, do interviewing, if that's part of your job, trying to understand the narrative and how memory and narrative work together when it comes to trauma. And it's giving that context of a whole person's life. So what happens when their brain is developing from their childhood, what's happened in different generations of their culture, of their community, of their family, and looking at, healing, looking at actual service options and very specific, whether you want to call it treatment or whether you want to call it, more so in that realm of healing, what's working when it comes to older women who've experienced often complex trauma throughout their life. So different types of trauma, different types of perpetrators. And what we can see is that the impacts of that compound over the lifespan. It also talks about what kind of words we're using and why we're using those words. And language is important to us at OAITH. It's important within the Aging Without Violence documents to really help us use language that might be more accessible to the survivors that we're working with, and also helps to push us to, reflecting trauma-informed practice within our work. And it also talks about intersectional identities and application of work, and really contextualizing trauma within oppression, social groups, the impact of sexism, classism, racism, ableism, homophobia, transphobia, and the trauma that has been experienced by survivors of different identities, by different communities, from different sectors, and understanding that historical context it's really important when we're thinking about how to do that, as we heard earlier, warm referral. If we know that, for example, we're talking about an older trans woman and she has accessed an emergency department and didn't get care that was equitable, or experienced transphobia when she accessed 15 years ago, and now doesn't want to access emergency level care because there isn't familiarity with the doctor. So that's a different connection with healthcare than it is when it's without that context. So let's look at some specific parts of this tool. This is, understanding trauma-informed principles. And as you can see, when you're actually in the tool, this is a screenshot, you're able to color different parts of the images with, these virtual, you can change kind of, if you want to use a marker, you want to use a crayon, and the size, you can erase things. And then you can download that and save it. So it will give you cues on how it's suggesting that you actually do some of the coloring. And then, you can refer back to that. So here it's saying, let's look at some of these foundations of trauma-informed work, and then having some reflection, having some critical analysis from that worker. So perhaps identifying, it's saying, in green, which they're confident with those trauma-informed principles, and then perhaps others in yellow, that's a principle that they're hoping to explore further. One principle that's often not really looked at in trauma-informed care is, for example, trauma-informed spaces. So physical spaces, digital spaces, how those are trauma-informed, what the cues are, the scent cues, the visual cues that could be trauma triggers. I do use the language of cues instead of triggers to note it's not something that you necessarily are, if you think of a trigger, something you pull or something you push, it is more so without that external force. It's cued by those trauma experiences often. Really seeing here, what's something that your agency might want to look at more, what's something that you might want to look at more. And a quote here from the guide, often it isn't the initiating trauma that creates a seemingly insurmountable pain, it's the lack of support after. So it's the lack of trauma-informed care for ages, across the lifespan when it comes to gender-based violence services or different types of services that actually equates to the harm or the greatest amount of impacts perhaps from the harm than the actual violence that they experience. So an example of that is survivors saying, I wasn't believed, right? So that might be in the criminal justice system, that might be in a different sector, and feeling as though their own experiences were minimized, and that compounding when that's happened perhaps multiple times or with different types of sectors. So another image from the Her Brain Chose for Her tool, and this is where you can actually color the brain. So I started to color it purple here, that section, and it is asking you to color the frontal lobe purple. So the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe blue, it's asking for different colors so that you can refer back to that. And it's also got extra information. So if you use the PDF version of Her Brain Chose, you're not going to get everything. For example, frontal lobe purple on the left image here, you're seeing when you actually click on the purple buttons on the right-hand side, you are going to have a pop-up and a voiceover that's going to tell you a little bit more about that section of the brain. So there is information in the guide about it, but this is value added. So it's telling you a little bit more about the parts of the frontal lobe. It's telling you about that executive functioning, and then you have that for each of the different sections there. And that's a tool, again, that's available online in French and English. So the web application as well as the PDF. And it's available, at no cost, and you don't have to sign up for anything. It is just, accessible. Another image from the tool, which goes into the experiences of complex trauma and what might contribute to that, and also some of the impacts. And each of these has a different kind of context when we're talking about older survivors. So the sexual abuse they've experienced, the physical abuse, witnessing violence, and that we can learn more about from, those ACE scores, adverse childhood experiences. And there's some information about that in the her brain trust for her tool. Emotional abuse, sometimes called psychological abuse, emotional neglect, physical and medical neglect, educational neglect, war, terrorism, forced migration, and that kind of contributing to experiences of complex trauma. We also have, systemic violence would contribute to that as well. For example, experiences of systemic ableism or racism or classism. On the right-hand side, we can see a summary coming from some of Laurie Haskell's work in relation to the impacts of trauma. And so if we think about this and kind of picture a survivor, and if that survivor is perhaps in their 60s, that's going to have different meaning for us and different implications for service and referral and support than it does if we're looking at a younger counterpart. And really recognizing, if someone is experiencing complex trauma, the impacts of complex trauma, and they have pieces from all these different bubbles, how does that impact their ability to follow through with a safety plan, for example? How does that impact their ability to remember and show up to appointments? If we start in that bubble on the top right, emotional cognitive, trouble concentrating, irritability, fear, anxiety, depression, difficulty managing anger, dissociation, memory and time loss, emotional numbness, kind of that feeling of flatness. All of those things can be very impactful in relation to actually getting to and making appointments, following through with for example, to-do lists that might be given. Older women have told us that they're not a fan of lengthy to-do lists, no matter who's giving them to them. If they haven't asked to skill build around that, if the capacity of the worker could be to just do it, just make that phone call, often that is what they'd like, rather than having, that piece of skill building or empowerment assumed that might be helpful for them. And physical, going to the left, chronic pain and numbness. We're more likely to experience that as we age. Headaches, that might be from long-term head injury. When we talk about traumatic brain injury, that might include a head injury, being pushed into something, falling for older women. A lot of times that initial report is falling, but then there was actually a push or something that was abusive in nature related to that, and also strangulation, which clients will typically call choking, because they don't see strangulation as something that can occur without lethality. So that also, of course, is a loss of air and can lead to chronic headaches, traumatic brain injury, and a range of kind of neurological issues, respiratory problems, sleep problems, which we know are exacerbated by a number of issues related to aging, and digestive issues. Behavioral overspending, that piece of a difference in ability to manage finances, perhaps, substance use, and with older women, the most common substance would be alcohol. And coming from a harm reduction framework would also be within a trauma-informed framework, that those go hand in hand. And we do have training available about that on our training portal. I'll show you a little about that in a few moments. And isolation from family and friends. So if that's gone on for decades, if they have lost connection with family and friends, that's something that affects their ability to kind of engage in different forms of safety planning that involve that third party and really having that emotional support. involvement in the justice system, that we see more and more dual charges. We see more and more that aggressors using the criminal justice system as a tool of abuse. And particularly in Ontario, issues with the application of mandatory charging. Interpersonal, going down to the bottom, difficulty maintaining relationships, and those might be family relationships or other types. Trouble setting boundaries and that assertiveness and lack of trust. So we can see that with older women that it might be in different areas of their lives. And spiritual, that loss of connection to faith, higher power. And often, if we're working with, for example, Indigenous women, part of that healing, part of that, service or support would often be connecting with traditional resources that might be available, and really trying to promote that connection to culture, feelings of guilt, shame, and self-hate. So if we think about all of those bubbles, with older women and complex trauma, they might all be working together at the same time. And then those impacts, this is kind of what we see here on the left in terms of how that affects her as a whole person. And all of the kind of bird's eye view impacts. And we've used a flower and the lifespan of a flower to just visualize some of that. So adverse childhood experiences, kind of witnessing abuse, experiencing abuse, neglect, parents with substance issues, any of those things are kind of within that scale. Disrupted neurodevelopment, emotional, social, and cognitive changes, high risk behavior. And then what we see if someone's experienced gender-based violence and complex trauma throughout their life is more likely to have different types of diseases, to have different types of issues, especially in relation to relationships and kind of overall functioning, and then physical pain, physical issues. And ultimately, that does relate to not living as long, that we've noted there within that image on the left. The image on the right is another interactive part of the workbook that is about the nervous system. So you can kind of separate the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system here with some colors. And then it will also tell you different things about, for example, if you look at constricts bladder or relaxes bladder, that would relate to in the immediate, or I should say during a traumatic violent episode, that someone might lose control of their bladder. That would be very common, especially with tonic or toxic immobility where they've actually frozen. And that might also happen afterwards in the immediate aftermath. And it might be a long-term issue that occurs. So that's kind of helping to understand kind of the person and their whole body and some of their health issues and how there might be some connections there with trauma. This is part of the workbook that, again, talks about aging and the brain in a very specific way within a gender-based violence context. So on the left, we've got some pieces about grief, which if we look at ourselves as workers, if we look at our sector and kind of the changes, if we look at older women and clients in general, often grief is a really unexplored realm that accumulates those impacts over time and is often very misunderstood in relation to people being pushed to move on or to go through specific stages of grieving, and a lot of non-evidence-based kind of grief knowledge that we feel like we have, but it's not really rooted in those pieces of knowing what's helpful from the evidence for survivors of gender-based violence. And this talks about complicated grief or traumatic grief that hasn't resolved over a long time, and kind of some of the changes in the brain. On the right side, there's two different images here. So the first image depicts a healthy brain, and the second shows a brain of a person with dementia. So it's having some of that context there. And, it's not a medical resource, but it's providing some information that's connecting with trauma in the brain to, for example, the impacts of dementia and cognition changes that might conflate and relate to and really compound all those impacts on cognition of complex trauma. This is a video, and that's the link there, bit.ly, it's just the toaster. And it's a video that's available in our resource library and on our website. And it is a very brief explanation of complex trauma. And it's using the analogy of a toaster. So the toaster being something that's alerting you to, potential risk or harm. And that if you're exposed to that, for example, not the toaster. So the toaster, let's say if there's burning toast, you would know about the smoke, you would know about the potential risk there because of the smoke alarm. But if the smoke alarm is very close to the toaster and it was going off all the time, that's kind of explaining what it might be like for someone who's experienced a lot of trauma, where constantly they're being alerted to danger, but there might not actually be danger, or because they're hearing it all the time, they might just start ignoring it. So this is a really quick video that's a bit of an introduction to that topic, and again is available. It's linked over to within the Her Brain Shows for Her tool, but it's also a independent resource that you can access and share. So this is something that I spoke about in my last presentation, if you might have been there, but I felt it was important to include for those who might not have had some of that content, and just some unique considerations for older women. So we know that they have a lot of barriers to accessing services. They're less likely to identify what they're experiencing as abuse than their younger counterparts. They're more likely to have distrust of systems. They're more likely to have concerns about the impacts on their relationships. We heard about some examples of, where the abuser is, where the aggressor is the survivor's child, right? So that's a very different dynamic than it is if that's a former partner, for example. They're more likely to be financially dependent on the person who's hurting them. And they also have that higher risk for physical harm and lethality if there's that other piece of marginalization. So gender diverse, Indigenous, immigrant, refugee, kind of newcomer women, racialized, differently abled. We know, of course, about the unique impacts of that complex trauma. And there's a lot of, for example, postmenopausal considerations for how trauma impacts women, that you kind of have to dig pretty far down into the research to see that. So it's important, even if you have training on gender-based violence, to really seek out training that's specific to older women on gender-based violence. And different attitudes about what's okay and not okay in abusive relationships, and again, what defines abuse. And overall, those increased barriers to accessing services and supports can lead to increased risk, and that's harm, that's lethality. I'll talk a little bit in a moment about older women and femicide, and that's something that we're often doing advocacy about at OAITH. So just a brief overview of a resource that might be helpful for you called Word to the Wise Fact Sheets. And we have 10 different fact sheets that are available on the website in that older women section. And they walk through different topics. So this specific one is about the language we're using and older women and violence in general. So it's talking about the rates, kind of the numbers of older women that we have. You've got a piece down there on the right of, the different life stages and the different impacts of abuse in those different life stages, and really talking about why we're focused on older women within this project, within these resources. So that provides some of the context there. Number two is like a resource list. So that's a good snapshot of, some of them, depending on the sector you're from, you might be aware of and not others. So Native Women's Association of Canada has some great resources. The National Initiative for Care of the Elderly, often called NICE, Elder Abuse Prevention Ontario, the National Clearinghouse on Abuse Later in Life. We've also got some specific gender-based violence resources. So the VW Learning Network, and we've highlighted some specific fact sheets that they have. The Registered Nurses Association of Ontario, we've got OAITH there, and also the Neighbors, Friends and Family for Older Adults project. We have within the fact sheets information about those intersectional approaches. So on the top, you're seeing a bit about what are the barriers that we're seeing from our research. So for example, if you don't have programming that's specific for older women, and there's no older, if you're gender-based violence service, and there's no older women within your signage, so you're not seeing them on your website or in your materials, it might be that she doesn't think your organization can support her age group, right? Or doesn't have kind of those specific supports. And that not being aware of the services is something that we see more likely when it comes to older women. And that intersectional approach is really key in providing trauma-informed support, recognizing your own place of privilege and marginality within, these identities, and also recognizing your client and the overall systems which impact their experiences as they, go through life. Number 4 is focused on, kind of LGBTQ plus 2SI communities, understanding some of those barriers to support, understanding, what are perhaps some things that we can do to really increase visibility, accessibility, and staff capacity. If you're not aware of the 519, that's a great resource to check out. And, they have specific frameworks to actually review and ensure that your organization, for example, in a physical way, is showing accessibility and is being accessible. Number 5 is all about femicide in older women. So femicide is something that OAITH does quite a bit of work on. We publish an annual femicide list every year, and we also publish monthly femicide lists, which provide a snapshot of femicide rates in Ontario and a yearly femicide report. Our latest femicide list had 52 names that was published this past November. The youngest on that list was 8 years old, and the oldest was 88 years old. So we saw in our last list about 21% of femicide victims were over age 55. In recent years, we've had as many as half or slightly over half of our femicide victims on our annual list in Ontario being older women. So we know there's different types of relationships there. Current partner, former partner. For family members, the most likely that we're seeing is a son, grandson, son-in-law. We also have some femicides of older women that would be by a neighbor or an acquaintance, and sometimes where the relationship is unknown. This is our 6th fact sheet that focuses on capacity, and there's different types of capacity. And some of you have a great deal of knowledge about this. We heard a bit about capacity and specifically the OPGT earlier today, and kind of when are times that you might want to engage some of these, and when are times that it might not be helpful. And this talks specifically about kind of understanding gender-based violence and capacity in relation to sexual consent and intimate relationships. So that might be in relation to divorce, for example. This is a 2-page fact sheet. Some are 2, some are 1 page, and it talks about older women in rural areas. And this, diagram on the left side is talking about what are some of those solutions to some of those barriers, right? So are you targeting, volunteer outreach towards older women is one of the examples there. Is that something where there's mobile services that are available in your community that older women have often found helpful when there's transportation barriers? So you can find all of these fact sheets on the website. This one is unique and diverse barriers for immigrant and refugee older women. Each fact sheet is available in French and English and downloadable as a PDF. And this talks about some of the barriers, some of the research there. It provides some insight from the South Asian Women's Center, and also some specific resources for follow-up for service providers. Specifically about sexual violence, our 9th A Word to the Wise sheet was created in collaboration with the Ontario Coalition of Rape Crisis Centers. And that talks about some, specific, risk factors or things, warning signs, gaps in the, gaps in services, gaps in research in relation to older women and sexual violence. And our last fact sheet was about older women with disabilities and older deaf women, little d or big D. And you can learn more about that from the fact sheet. There's some great resources there as well. And we, of course, have training that's in our training portal that is specific to working with survivors of violence with different abilities. So I'm going to skip over the scenario here. One of the videos that we have available both on our website and in our resource library are scenarios that involve older women and gender-based violence and discussion prompts, helping your organization to discuss what should we be doing here. And it does give some suggestions for best practice as well. This video depicts emotional abuse. They're in an audiology wait room. So it's someone that she doesn't have a lot of experience with that service provider, and there's warning signs of abuse occurring in the relationship in the wait room, and he wants to come into the audiology appointment as well. So that's a 5-minute video and a great way to start that discussion in your agency. We also have a video guide that's about crisis calls, and it does feature an older woman. It's available in French and English. And you can, hear about her situation. You can hear how the counselors responded, and then you can see pop-ups of what the counselor's thinking. So you can see why she's responded in the way she has. And we'll be coming out with some new videos soon that complement and continue this series of Beneath the Iceberg, kind of all those things that we might not hear about if we don't ask the right questions. There are 2 new training videos that are available on the website. The one is a webcast, 1.5 hours, that's just about preventing and responding to violence against older women. And then there's one that's about kind of understanding gender-based violence and having that foundation. So those are both available. You don't have to sign up for anything. And this is just a question that we're kind of asking within all of our resources and all of our work with survivors is how will your agency, or how does your agency show women older women, they are valued within your services? And again, part of that is thinking about your outreach as well as the programs that exist and the specific, kind of target audiences there. We do have a training portal where you can sign up for free, and then you can purchase courses. So we have one on risk management and working with older women. We have one on preventing and responding to violence against older women. And there's, outlines, so you can learn more about what's in that course before you might choose to purchase it. And these are some of the silos that exist that we're just in general hoping to break down. Elder abuse and gender-based violence. This is a great example today of breaking down those silos, that we have information that's more general, and then some with that gender lens. And the different types of violence. So someone might be experiencing different types of violence from different types of perpetrators, and we need a capacity to be able to respond to that, rather than kind of just looking at partner violence or family violence, and looking at a person as a whole person and everything that they've experienced. And that really helps us, whether we're providing general service or looking at assessing risk, safety planning, and really addressing concerns through, advocacy. This is a new resource that we have available called Mulberry Finder, and it is live. You can go on, it's focused on Ontario, and find resources that are related to gender-based violence. You also might find, if you are Ontario Gender-Based Violence Organization, that you'd like to be listed on Mulberry. And you can request that on the website. So it's mulberryfinder.ca. And it's kind of everything from gender-based violence organizations to survivor-led groups, perpetrator aggressor services, and helping you to find really specific information about those services. So for example, do they have a transitional program? Are they, accessible physically? Is that something where they're under a harm reduction framework? So mulberryfinder.ca, and this is kind of how it shows up. You've got these different icons showing you, do they do chat support? Do they, provide pet accommodation? And you can search for services. Maybe you want to use the map, maybe you don't. So there's lots of filters in there. And you can also request that you'd like to be added, your organization you feel is appropriate to be on Mulberry. You can go to the website and it will, lead you to request access now. And you would request access and then create an account and, a listing for your agency and programs. So that is pretty much it. OAITH.ca is where we have that section of the website where you can find the resources I've talked about today. I'm going to put up my contact information for any follow-up, and then we will move to any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Amber. What an insightful overview of such great information. As I've been looking at the chat box, there's been just such great comments coming back and forth. Thanking you so much for this very high level overview. So a few questions that we have some time to get to. We have a few participants that have asked us, in your opinion, what really do you see as the way forward for services and supports as Canada ages, as our female population ages? Where are also the shortfalls that you see with healthcare providers, frontline service providers, and what actions need to be done? So sorry, there's a few questions there in one, but I think we're sort of looking for your expert opinion to help guide us.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a couple-parter, but I'm fine with that. So if there was one thing that I wanted people to start off with and look at as an agency and as a worker and think about what it's saying and what it's, exposing as the gaps, but also offering as solutions, it is the Aging Without Violence gap analysis. So I talked a bit about that in my last presentation, so I didn't go into it today just in case we had repeat folks. But it's available under the report section in Aging Without Violence. And it really, says this is what we're not doing well. And some of that is by sector. So it might talk about shelters and it might talk about healthcare, but then it also says here are the recommendations. If I have to pick one recommendation, it kind of, is the foundation of the work that we've done in this project, but also our work at OAITH and our work as a sector with gender-based violence survivors, is we have to actually understand what trauma-informed means. And that trauma-informed language is overused and it's understood. And it's something where it has a cultural place and context. It has often, doesn't kind of leave room for actual experiences of survivors and older women. And it might be, really focused on, what's evidence that we're seeing that's, published through, sometimes colonial structures. We have to also see what's happening in communities, right? So that piece of understanding trauma-informed and just connecting with sectors. So are you, and you can add this, I can't see the chat, but Mary will tell me, are you, part of your community's elder abuse network? Are you part of your community's violence against women coordinating committee, VWCC? So those exist in many communities across Ontario, if you're joining us today from there. And often we're seeing that there's a systems table that's talking about these issues and another system table that's talking about these issues. They're not talking to each other. So yourself could be that link by reaching out and participating in those different tables, because those tables are both, we've seen in our research, doing work specifically around elder abuse and around gender-based violence in older women, but they're often disconnected in terms of, if you're coming from a shelter today, are you connected with senior supports in your area? If you're coming from senior supports today, are you connected with your community sexual violence and domestic violence treatment center to talk about, the evidence timelines in relation to referral, which are always shocking. Every time I sit in one of those presentations, people think it's a few days instead of weeks that evidence can actually be collected. So there is information that is so great within our sectors, but it's not being shared, right? And silos are effective things. They keep the grain dry, right? I'm from a rural community, but we've got to, there's an opening up, right? There's a process there, right? That we can't just leave it to kind of stay in itself and stagnate. It's got to be that dissemination of all this good stuff that we all know. So coming today is a great step. Thank you for that question. And yeah, the gap analysis would be the top document there.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for mentioning the elder abuse networks throughout Ontario that we have. And if anyone on the call would like more information about that, I will put my email in the chat so you can reach out to me and we can connect you with a local network. We've got well over 35 in Ontario right now and doing great work. And as Amber said, we need to break those silos down, keep the communication open, those lines of communication going, definitely. Next question, we had a few about, again, in your expert opinion, looking for starting those supportive conversations, especially when there may be cultural differences and having that trust being able to build with an older adult, a female who may not a newcomer to Canada and, for the first time experiencing someone reaching out to her for getting help for her. But again, she may have a roadblock up, of course, for many reasons. How can we help some of those supportive conversations?
Yeah, so part of cultural appropriate service, is there's different aspects. So you've got training. So you can get training that's about, being culturally accessible, but ultimately to raise capacity, you're going to have training on different types of communities and make connections with the services and the communities that are, providing that support. So an example would be, connecting with the Indigenous services and Indigenous communities that are near you to talk about training that they have available, to talk about how you can support their work, that you also might access training online, but that actual connection of people to call, of people to connect with, and those relationships, those are very important. We do have training that's on the Aging Without Violence site. We did a conference and all of the videos and slides are there from the conference. So we had some great training about specific communities. So the South Asian community, for example, and older women. So, that's a whole 2-hour slide deck just about older women from the South Asian community experiencing violence. Neighbors, friends, and family, it's not right. They do have some information that is targeted towards specific communities. There are great resources for Muslim women that have kind of emerged in the last few years, especially. And it's recognizing that you won't be able to do one training and now I'm culturally informed and I can provide the service. It's about constantly increasing capacity and looking at the communities that you're not serving as well. And why aren't they coming into your door, right? What is that connection? Excuse me. I live in a rural community where we have a very large Low German population, right? So looking at when we're producing resources, can we produce a resource that's text-based in Low German and have that lens? That's a piece of cultural appropriateness. What's on, your resources in terms of the actual language, in terms of the literacy level, and are you connected with, interpreters that can provide live interpretation. So we're not relying on friends and family members where we do not know the power dynamics. And we know very much from best practice that that is not appropriate, that we need to be utilizing, in Ontario, we have across translations and they're funded, that if you're providing any kind of gender-based violence service, they would provide live interpretation for that service.
Exactly. Excellent. Thank you so much. And we have time for one last question. And this is, I think, if I could say, it's a question. And a few people had put it in the chat box as a statement saying, is femicide, or some are saying femicide is an epidemic in Canada. And so maybe in closing, if I could get you to comment, just take a moment, have some water, no worries.
Cough attack there. Yes, femicide is an epidemic in Canada, and gender-based violence is also an epidemic in Canada. It's been called, the shadow pandemic, which kind of came out over COVID. And we have, been collecting femicide rates for decades at OAITH, and we can see the concern in the rates. We can see the concern, in the rising numbers, and that our list being 52 people last year. We have not always had a list, right? That's 52 femicides on that. This past summer was the first time that a femicide inquest was ever live streamed in Ontario. So that was the, Renfrew inquest. And there's 81, I believe, maybe 82 recommendations that are from that inquest. And the first one is declaring gender-based violence, intimate partner violence as an epidemic. And so that's something that a lot of violence against women coordinating committees are doing work around. I've put in the chat the link to the Building a Bigger Wave website, so you can find your local violence against women coordinating committee, and they are doing work on raising the alarm around femicide. So when there's a femicide in your community, they have specific resources to engage the media, to be talking about, what's the training that people are receiving, to be talking about the awareness there and how we take action. So absolutely, thank you for that comment.
Perfect. Thank you. Amber, again, on behalf of the entire team and staff at Elder Abuse Prevention Ontario, we want to thank you for your time today. And again, the chat box has lit up with so many thank yous and warm messages of great support for the work you are doing. So please never stop, continue. You are always welcome back to join us at our conferences. Thank you so much for all the information, wisdom, and knowledge you bring. And we will close it off, everyone, and we'll continue to see you at our next sessions in the conference. Again, Amber, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Take care. Bye-bye.